So here we are again since the last event. Had a similar conversation there. How does it feel? It's for me, it feels like a really long time ago. How much has happened since the last event?
We got a new Prime Minister in the UK, so yeah, quite a bit.
We're going to do a bit of mixed questions, both from the Slido and try to take something from the audience here if people have it. So we try to keep it a little bit live, and it's not just me reading from a phone all day. But we'll start off with some questions from Slido. Number one, top voted by far is, and I'm curious that so many people are interested in this, but what key management options are there for validators, e.g. HSM options?
I don't know.
So this is an active conversation that I'm in with many validator teams. Everyone is requesting remote signing. Everyone is requesting high availability setups and being able to use HSMs, being able to use TEEs, being able to use ledgers. People are kind of desperate for any kind of remote signing. And it is something that is obviously high on our priority list. A ledger ledger app is being built, so that might be the thing that comes first. Or just a basic remote signing that isn't a trusted kind of HSM environment, but at least a different computer that you can secure in a different way if you want to. But I was talking with a guy over here sitting front row, Substrate or Substrate TE, and talking about building a support for doing validator signing. And there's different levels here where on one hand you can just do signing anything that's being sent into a TE, but then you can also do things like preventing double signing, but you can do something super advanced like running a light client inside a TE to make sure that you're actually signing valid blocks. So there's a whole slew of things that we are working on actively. So while there isn't much option today, soon there will be.
Are we really actively working on them?
Yeah, we are.
The Substrate TEE, we're actively working on an SGX.
No, well, they are actively working on that, but we are actively working on making sure the node actually can send off a payload to an external signer.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's great that there's an obvious product that a lot of people who apparently have a bit of cash to spend are interested in buying. And I throw the welcome mat open to people who want to seize this opportunity for a bit of solid business development and entrepreneurial spirit to go find somewhere in the world that can create HSMs and make these guys something that they want and sell it to them for a nice fat profit. But honestly, it's not. Parity's not a hardware company. We're not going to be designing or manufacturing HSMs. So I would invite validators to create themselves a little validation group and go off and fund one of these things, or invite entrepreneurs in the audience to go and make something and sell it to these guys.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so when I say we're working on it, we're working on making sure that the node is able to give off the signing privileges to something else. And what that something else is, I don't particularly care about, but validators might. Second question is something that I know you can't really answer, but when can we run parachains on Kusama? You might be able to give at least an interesting discussion around it.
As soon as I'm convinced they won't destroy Kusama, which could be quite soon. It could be, I would hope that we can get something in many weeks in advance of when we are meant to open it up on the Polkadot mainnet. So let's hope sometime early on in the new year, like first 2 weeks of January. But it really does depend a lot on when Cumulus becomes sufficiently hardened.
I think the people in the audience who we're at the Cumulus workshop and have seen some of this in action now, have like a better idea when this will actually come. And if you weren't at those workshops, then maybe you can find it online later. So you can sort of convince yourself when you think it's going to be ready. How can you ensure a sustainable validator economy over time?
Well, this depends a lot on which validators, but assuming the relay chain validators, the idea isn't so much to create a sustainable, the question isn't so much how do you create a sustainable economy, but rather how do you guarantee a certain level of security. As long as these tokens have some value, then there will be, well, as long as the value that the tokens have is sufficient, such that 10% a year will pay off 1 or whatever 4 validators, the minimum number of validators required for the particular consensus to work, then it's good, right? It's in principle, it's secure to some degree. The issue is, well, maybe we want it to be more secure than you can, than like, I don't know, whatever, 50,000. You spend 50,000, you can suddenly break everything. So it's really at what point do we consider it secure, and that's really just a function of the token price. There's not much more to it than that.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the question asker means by a sustainable validator economy. I mean, is it just that as a validator, you make more in profit than you're spending on servers? Then that's pretty easy because it's not that expensive to run and validate. Like even a sophisticated validation setup is not that expensive to run.
Yeah, I suspect it's really just, I'm a validator and I want to make more money. How do you ensure that I'm making enough money such that I don't get the arsehole? It's like, well, different people have different levels of money that they need to make before they get upset and walk away. And it's, we're not really making much of an effort to try to ensure that the validators who have perhaps a little bit more self-entitlement than others, and who have sort of higher amounts that they want to make, are not going to walk away when there are perfectly good sort of decentralized alternatives. And I think you do see a lot of I feel that this message does come a lot more from the sort of the validators who consider themselves, actual validators, like professional validators who are running, professional validation operations. And really the way that the Polkadot sort of validation, the MPOS system works is to favor lots of smaller validators rather than these like large multi-node validation outfits. So it may just be that Polkadot doesn't offer an especially good rate of return for large validation outfits, and it really is something that's that ultimately ends up being serviced by many 1,000 individual or very, very small, not very professional validation outfits.
Yeah, I said the word sophisticated validator, and by that I mean basically just mean someone who is secure enough to actually provide the services. And an argument that I've heard, I mean, in the same vein of this question, is that these validator companies, these kind of big entities that are professionally running validation services, they're in high demand, and that networks are trying to convince them to validate for their network and kind of providing them better deals. So indeed, it might be a question of like competition, and this kind of to me goes against the spirit of proof of stake in the first place. If we're just putting everything in one company, then why are we bothering doing this thing at all? And but there's still a question of like, what is a sophisticated validator? How do we make sure that if it's not a few companies, how do we make the whole world sophisticated enough to be able to provide the services. And I think here, proof of stake is such an early technology that your average Joe probably isn't going to run a super secure setup, but this will quickly improve, I think. And it really isn't that hard to run something solid.
Yeah, I think it really just takes a few little tutorials, maybe one or two, bake your own validator kits, and it won't be too long before we get reasonably decentralized and secure system.
I'm going to ask one more question, then try to take one from the audience. If you have something, raise your hand already, and we'll get Alex to run your mic while I ask this next one. This was asked exactly the same at the last event. What is still missing for Polkadot mainnet?
Well, XCMP, so implementing all of that. That has been, the design for that is more or less finalized. It's now now it's really just the implementation, and that's something that's already been started on. But it's it's pretty complicated, so it will take a little while. Cumulus, I guess technically isn't needed for the mainnet, but it's needed for the mainnet to be useful. So it's something that kind of does need to be finished before we can really claim to have delivered it. Other than that, things are there. Things are in place. Kusama is going. It's a thing now. You can play around with it. It's fully public. I'm not in my godlike position over the network anymore. I was kicked out, booted from heaven. So yeah. There's not all that much that needs to be done in terms of the sort of base level version 1 of the mainnet, which is why we are talking about laying the potential Genesis block later this month. The audits obviously have to be done too.
All right.
I had a question about what you were thinking off-chain coordination might look like in the future, and how that will play into things like the governance in Kusama, Polkadot, etc.
Yeah, I mean, off-chain is. Ultimately, for the relay chain, we're trying to avoid any off-chain stuff that isn't directly connected to parachain validity. So. The idea is to remove all of the governance and all of the staking, even the balances stuff, off onto parachains. But talking sort of more generally, how I see it for parachains, I can definitely imagine we have. So one of the things I wanted to start working on in the not too distant future is a kind of a grand oracle system, so that we can actually implement oracles with a reasonable guarantee that it won't just ultimately come down to sort of opinionated validators or random sort of oligarchs that have been elected to the council. And so the idea behind that is to have a sort of a jury that is elected primarily on some objective real world criteria, and that would have they'd operate as a body that's off chain, but would otherwise act as a sort of oracle of last resort, and would be there would be some game theory as to why they would actually tell the truth. Probably a combination of professional liability with shelling points and sort of economic incentives. Thinking more kind of abstractly, once you've got this grand oracle, then you can have lots. You've really got the ability to have lots of smaller oracles, lots of think of price feeds, think of checking for identity. Hey, does this Facebook identity have this account ID on the page? Does check Twitter, do all of this kind of interesting pulling of data in from Web 2. I like the I like the stuff that Ben's been doing with the email oracle and email actuator, and of course it's off-chain, useful for both of them. Well, necessary pretty much for both of them. I don't know. There's a lot of stuff. There isn't really a super coherent, specific timeline for implementing any of it. It really comes down to what we feel at the time is the biggest opportunity or the most pressing need.
I'm going to ask a different read of the same question that I asked before about the sustainable validator economy, but a slightly more interesting take on that question for this audience would be, how do you design a good collator economy? How do you ensure that collators do their job?
Well, you make sure that they get paid. I mean, if you don't want to do it yourself, it could be that the project just runs their own collator nodes. If there's relatively little, if there's a degree of trust, relatively little risk of there being problematic censorship, or relatively little risk of your users believing that there is problematic censorship, then maybe it's the right way forward. Assuming that you want to incentivize others to do the collation for you, then transaction fees are the obvious way of incentivizing it, essentially getting your transactors to pay your collators. And you can have a transaction fee economy using some sort of floating value and have the value go up if blocks if transactions aren't getting in, and have the value go down if they are. It's kind of stuff that's already relatively well known how it works. Like I don't think I need to sort of answer in terms of how transaction fees can form a valid economy. Now then it's like, well, okay, why do we trust the collators? Like how is it, what's the consensus? And the thing is, there is no need for consensus at the collator level. There's no need for trust, and there's no need for punishment, because collators are not in any position of power, right? The parachain validators coming from Polkadot are, but they are already incentivized by virtue of being in Polkadot. Now you might want to have some form of pre-selection for your collators. So it might be that you have a very basic proof of work, which gives collators or gives your collator candidates a ticket to become a collator and therefore author a block to collect transaction fees. It may be that you have a proof of stake. It may just be you have a whitelist that a council decides. I don't know. It kind of depends on your parachain. It's likely that we will do some sort of proof of stake variant, or we might actually implement a proof of work and a proof of stake variant as part of sort of the basic set of palettes for Cumulus. But in principle, you don't even need those. In principle, you can still just have collators be entirely free and open, and anyone can collate, and just they fire it off, and Polkadot parachain validators might get a bit spammed with block candidates, but yeah, it should still basically work.
Where do we stand regarding multi and threshold SIGs? And I kind of have to read this as on the relay chain, like having multi-sig and threshold SIGs as like a native feature on the relay chain, because on a Substrate chain, you can of course just implement this yourself. It's just a thing that you implement. So on the relay chain, is there a plan to support these things natively?
Yes, although as I say, the relay chain, we are trying to reduce functionality. So there's two ways of going, and we'll likely do both. One of them is actually already kind of done. So the Schnorr Ristretto variant of 24519 that we work with on the relay chain already supports threshold multisig. So you can do that today. The software is out there. There's very little user level support, but in principle the APIs are there and it can be done. It's just waiting for someone to make it easy. that's something that we'll probably integrate at some point next year into Parity Signer. So when you create an account, you'll be able to create an account that uses like 3 different Parity Signers, or 2 Parity Signers and one hot account, and be able to send to it, and then use the hot account plus a Parity Signer in order to empty it. There's the other thing that we can go with is something that's like much more in the style of the current Bitcoin multisig, where you've got some on-chain logic that actually counts how many signatures there are, and when the hits a sufficient level, releases the funds or whatever, sends on a transaction. This is something I want to put in anyway. It's unlikely to make its way onto the relay chain, but it'll be something that's kind of useful for parachains. I mean, it might make its way onto the relay chain. We'll see how much account stuff there is on the relay chain at the end. But the idea is that it's a super general way of remixing how accounts work. So you'll be able to create new accounts that are like proxy accounts that are just rewired configurations of pre-existing accounts. So simple way of doing that is, well, we've got the account something, it's just created, it's just like a random hash, like the account is nothing special. But there's a kind of pseudo-like module, so you're familiar with the pseudo module. One of the variants in the pseudo module is pseudo as, so you can send in a transaction from the pseudo ID, and also a call and an account ID that you want the call to be made from. And all the pseudo does is the pseudo as function does is it checks that it comes from the current pseudo account. And if it does, then it just redispatches a new call, the one that was passed in, but this time from the account ID that was passed in. So it's very similar to the Unix style like sudo thing, where you can specify what account it is that you want to run as next. Now, what this would do, though, is basically the same thing, except it would only ever run from this one new hash account that was just an empty account, so it's fine that it runs from that account, that it's called from that account. You still pass in the call that you want to come from that account, but you pass in some other account, and it allows some other account to kind of redirect itself as one of these accounts that it's created. So it allows one account, you to retain the key of just one account, but to control many different accounts with that one account key. And you just state which account it is that you want to control whenever for each transaction that you want to move. Now, the reason that I want to do this is because if you're controlling lots of different validators, so maybe you've got like 10 validators, maybe you're Adrian Brink, you've got 30 validators on Kusama, right? And you've got 30 controller keys. And it's a real pain having 30 different accounts, like administering 30 different accounts. Suppose you've got like 30 different nomination accounts, and you want to add one extra validator to each of those 30 different nomination accounts. Now you have to do like 30 different keys you have to sort of bring out of cold storage or fart around with using your mobile app. Much easier if you only got one key. So the idea is that you have just like one super controller key that has many different kind of sub accounts that it has control over. Yeah. And then the idea is that you can also batch up transactions. So you can make a single transaction that has like 30 different renomination transactions in it, and then just a vec of 30 different accounts that you want to send it from, and then you fire off one transaction, you sign it once, and it sends it from all 30 accounts, these 30 different transactions. And then you can combine that with a multisig. So now you can say, instead of there just being a single account that controls this, well, the single account is actually another proxy account that's a proxy for a 2 of 3 multisig. So you first send the thing that you want to send on from one of these 3 of the 2 or 3 multisig. Then you send a hash of the thing from the second of the 3 from the 2 or 3 multisig. And what that does is it says, there was already one here. I'll send that off. And now I know the pre-image because that was what the first guy gave me. And then that goes into this controller sort of fan out thing, which then resends it from the 30 different accounts. So what you can do now is like have all sorts of crazy ways of organizing how your accounts work, still within the account system, but separating it off and abstracting it out from this assumption that there's like one private key per account.
Yeah, this really actually reminds me of Alex Vandersand's whole scheme for logins that he's been talking about for a long time. This is in the Ethereum world, where then all of these kind of proxy accounts require all their own contract, and it's a super complicated setup. But the use case is basically that you have all these different dApps, and you don't really want to use the same identity on all dApps, but you also don't want to create 10 accounts and split all your money across these 10 accounts and have to like pay transaction fees from all these different accounts when you're interacting with different dApps. So it's sort of like you have a bunch of different identities split up on different applications because you don't want to use the same key with everything. You don't want to be identified as the same person on all applications. But you can effectively control many different applications from this one key, but still kind of remain somewhat anonymous.
Yeah, I mean, the anonymity thing isn't really provided with this. It'd be really obvious to see which accounts are behind which other accounts. The anonymity thing would have to, come through some crazy, like, ZK snarky cryptographic scheme. But yeah, in principle, it could be that the balances are shared, or rather the balances are moved just in time. So it's kind of like you only have one account with a balance, but then immediately before it sends the transaction in this kind of fan-out operation, it just puts enough of the balance in. And
it's just a proxy kind of thing.
Yeah.
All right, do we have an audience question? Anyone?
Thank you. So my question is, how is it going to be the exchange of dots, and if there are any plans for a decentralized exchange?
We, as Parity, don't plan to build a decentralized exchange.
But I know of plans to build decentralized exchanges. Someone will.
So yeah, I think it wouldn't be difficult once there is a bridge. Then it's pretty trivial just to have a market between the two tokens that exists within, on the bridge, potentially on the bridge parachain, potentially on a separate parachain. It's like I guess the tricky thing is like integrating it into front ends, making it usable, and all the rest of it. But again, that's not really something that we're aiming to take on ourselves.
All right, I'll take one from Slido. This is one that I get asked quite a lot as well, but I feel like we've answered it a ton, and I don't like. Maybe we have to find a new way of answering this question. But what is the difference between DPoS and NPoS?
One of them is secure, and one of them isn't. Al is by far the better person to answer this than me, but basically DPoS is sort of a more of a voting system. So it's like allows holders of the token to place their weight behind oligarchs with no recourse if the oligarchs, for whatever reason, are bad. Or validators, sorry. There's the assumption with DPoS is, well, if they're bad, then the token base will, token holder base will move them onto other validators, which kind of doesn't really work because the point is the attack scenario isn't we have lots of people who are all paying a lot of attention and who care even if their tokens are 100% secure. The attack scenario is, well, we have someone who wants to, I don't know, pass an invalid transaction. How many of the tokens do they need to buy and hold before their transaction goes through? With NPoS, we retain a similar voting mechanism, but the difference is that the votes are, they stay with, well, rather, those who you vote for, those oligarchs or those validators that you vote for, are a portion of your total vote is assigned to them. And the portion that's assigned to them is an optimization problem. But a portion of it, somewhere between 0 and all of your votes, are assigned to them. And your votes are your stake. And what this implies is that if that oligarch does something bad, or the validator sort of is malicious, then it means that you can be slashed, right? So you are at risk of losing your tokens. Now this awesomely alters, it radically changes the economic impetus now for me as a token holder, because there's a risk involved. And when there's a risk involved, it's like, right, well, I'm not just going to vote for the guy that gives me the most money or gives me the most freebies. It will be, I will vote for someone that I believe isn't going to lose me my money, which means either that they've put up a lot of their money themselves, which means they will take the risk of slashing before I do, or it means it's someone that I've actually looked into and I've researched, and they have a big community footprint, and they seem like real people, and maybe they've got their validation equipment audited, maybe they've been around for a long time, maybe I've met them in person, maybe I know where they live. And in general, there's a degree of trust that I know that this particular person or this particular outfit probably isn't going to go do anything bad. And the trust need not be blind trust, it need not be faith, it can be evidence-based. So it could be that, yeah, as I say, there may be independent audits that have done, it may be that you actually visited this. If you're talking about a significant amount, it may be that you visited and you've inspected it yourself, what their operation's like. So critically, NPOS has risk involved, and that means that the game theory is different. It means that people will back those that are least likely to be malicious for the network, and it means that those who are validating have a much bigger impetus, much bigger incentive not to misbehave.
Yeah, I mean, I can understand people's confusion, especially as a non-English native speaker. The difference between delegating and nominating is I mean, it's sort of, this is the same thing, and sort of I'm giving something to someone else. But I get like, and on top of this, DPoS has been massively confused by 50 different protocols calling their thing DPoS, but actually being completely different things between all 50 of them. But I guess the short summary is like, one carries risk for the person giving or like assigning their tokens away, and the other one does not. What is next on the priority list for Substrate?
Well, there is some degree of parallelization, so we can have more than one thing, but roughly, next year should have more interesting off-chain workers. That's something that I think we're going to be pushing forward on because it is so useful. Cumulus and XCMP, obviously are super high on the list as well. If we're talking pure Substrate, then parallelization. So the ability to execute transactions in parallel, but also the ability to have just general worker threads within your runtime. So it might be that you've got stuff that isn't to do with transaction execution, but rather is a job that just happens to need to be done in the background, and that's something that we'll probably want to do as well.
Or you might have many jobs that you want to do, like computing proofs or whatever it may be.
Yeah, I mean, you might not want to compute proofs on the runtime, but yeah. One example might be the the fragment election stuff, where you can probably, depending on how much data is involved, do that in parallel to executing a bunch of transactions. Although that's more of a candidate for off-chain computation as well. What else? I mean, Ben already touched on this in his talk, but like some refactoring of the runtime macros. So there's a general desire to move away from the decal module, decal storage, decal event, and all the rest of it to just straight tags, very similar to how the syntax of Ink works now. yeah, that'll be really nice if we can do that. But I mean, it's a fairly large job, so we'll see.
General Rust improvement is obviously high on the priority list, like adopting async await and making the code base nicer. But if the question is not just Substrate core, there's obviously a ton of stuff happening in the Substrate ecosystem as a whole. Like in my slide, I showed sort of what's going on in core, what's going on in runtime, what's going on overall, and Parity is expending a massive amount of effort on tooling, and I think that is, as we're getting closer to maturity and having things deployed, tooling is a high priority.
Also, an increasing amount of optimization and analytics, debugging aids, metrics and telemetry. This is all stuff that we have direct efforts, like focused efforts on now.
Yeah. Before I ask the next Slido question, does anyone in the audience have anything? Anything Substrate based instead of Polkadot based? All the other questions in Slido are Polkadot questions.
Touching on exactly that aspect, what about runtime governance modules? I've seen you doing the membership council thing.
Lots in store for the palettes. So if you're not familiar, the palettes already had a membership palette to allow you to create this a club of accounts that could act as a collective. We have the collective palette that allowed them to act as a collective. We have the fragment elections that allowed you to create a club from a bunch of staked, sort of a proof of stake club. In addition to these, there's also going to be actually there is already a palette done which is the selected, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's like a selected membership group. This will form the basis, I hope, assuming that the Kusama Council goes ahead with it, for a Kusama Grand Oracle Committee. Much like, as I mentioned earlier, this would be the sort of top oracle that would allow an appeal process from lower, less well-staked oracles. And on top of that, I'm also currently working on a society module that allows essentially a membership group to grow based upon membership criteria the criteria being evaluated off-chain by the existing members. So there's again another experiment that I would like to push out on the Kusama chain that would use this sort of Kusama this society palette in order to create a membership of sort of citizens of Kusama, let's say. In addition to that, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that a lot of ideas floating around for governance, and I think we've got a really nice sort of between the origins and the membership abstractions, we've got a really nice base on which to build these kinds of social constructs and roll them out in in different guises.
There's "We live in a society" meme to be made somewhere in there. Would you be open for starting a Kusama meme competition?
Definitely, yeah. No, we should definitely do
that. Speaking of Kusama, there's a question here. Where do you see Kusama in 3 years? Is it still in operation? Will it be used as an experimental network for parachains?
It's really hard to predict, but I certainly hope that Kusama will still be in operation in 3 years' time. As I say, I would. One of the ways that we kind of try and categorize Kusama is there's a Litecoin to Polkadot's Bitcoin. So something with which we can push out earlier, crazier, more experimental features, maybe stuff that, like, you know, with Polkadot, for example, it has to remain stable. You know, it's super important, and so we're not going to do crazy experiments on Polkadot. We're not going to put additional runtime modules on Polkadot. It's going to stay as minimal as possible, and we're going to try and push as much into the parachains. And we're not going to make the work any harder for us by adding extra features until that's done. Kusama, it's like, you know, let's see what works. Let's see what doesn't work. That's kind of the raison d'etre of Kusama. So adding some interesting features to it, adding some interesting governance stuff to it, and seeing what comes out of it is definitely something that I'm interested in doing. So yeah, 3 years' time, I would hope it's still going, still has a vibrant community, has a really good meme competition. You know, had lots of artwork and memes coming out of it, and has led the way for Polkadot features, but also for you know, features that have made it out into the general ecosystem.
Something I'm particularly excited about with Kusama is, you know, blockchains have built up this kind of vibe now that it has to be super stable. We can't experiment. We can't do anything interesting or exciting anymore. Once it's published, it should stay this way forever. I mean, even like sort of experimental in name things are kind of going, no, this is it now, and we're not going to change. So building up a community of people who are expecting chaos, who actually want to have some fun, like that would be an amazing community to be in. And I think that is a different community than the ones that will be on Polkadot. So
yeah, definitely.
A question in the audience back there.
Hi, what are the biggest risks for the Polkadot universe from your point of view?
Biggest risk from the Polkadot
Universe.
Universe. Okay. There's okay. So the smallest risk I see is the product risk. I think it's still a risk, but I'm relatively bullish that this idea of parachains and parathreads, I think is probably a sensible one. Like the fact that other chains have now, particularly like Shasper, have come up and said, oh, actually, would be pretty cool if we had domain-specific shards. It's like, okay, yeah, well, that's what Polkadot is. So yeah, I think broadly speaking, the value proposition is sensible and on target, and I suspect it's going to be copied by a lot of other things in the future. The next risk is tech risk. That is a risk. It's like what happens if the technology fails. You know, we're doing what we can to mitigate this with things like Kusama, with audits, with, you know, code reviews and all the other sort of measures that we have in place to try to minimize the chance of bugs making it in there. But we've also built ourselves a bunch of like fail-safe mechanisms as well, and those are things that we will continue doubling down on as the mainnet moves towards launch. So I still think it's a bigger risk than product risk, but I'd still say it's like a manageable risk. And then probably the biggest risk I would say is the risk of competition, because that's the most unknown risk, at least to me. It's not clear at what level competition is at. I think there's always the possibility that, you know, other teams will come along and just magically come off, pull out a sort of unicorn. It's the other, like, sort of related to that is just the thing of, you know, to what degree is the product Polkadot able to be properly communicated and marketed. So it's all very well having the product, and it's all very well the product actually being useful, but unless everybody knows that it's useful and they know that in order to do this thing you have to come to Polkadot to do it, then it's you know, it's still a risk. for the system being actually used, for the system fulfilling its proposition. So it's happily the crypto community is relatively like there's a lot of cross-pollination going on between it. So again, I don't think it's like an insurmountable risk, but it's definitely something that we need to be conscious of, and something that we need to make sure everyone from the various corners of the ecosystem are familiar with precisely what Polkadot does, what its value proposition is, separate to other projects. And we need to be clear about, we need to make the on-ramp as easy as possible, basically.
We are out of time, so I'm just gonna ask one final little question from an anonymous poster. Can you send me 10,000 KSM?
It's an anonymous poster. Did they give an address?
They did not.
Ah, well.
Sorry, should have given an address.
Unlucky, you missed the trick there. If I had the address right now, then I would completely do that. But I don't.
All right, thank you very much.
Cheers.